Good evening, everyone. This is TJ or Tejinder from Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. We are back after a couple of months of hiatus. We are back with an excellent session today. Joe Kwasniewski, he would be talking about Shorebird ID 101. But before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. If we can keep ourselves muted, as Joe is going through the slides. Joe has a couple of slides in the middle where he will pause to get some question and answers, but we'll take most of the questions towards the end. We'll leave time for that. It's a fairly interactive session. So with those 2 or 3 slides in the middle, you can have a couple of questions. Just type your questions in the chat. Tara Bostatter, who is my co-host today, she will help us coordinate those questions. We'll also be posting a couple of links as you have been following the barn owlet journey at the refuge. And I know many of you have supported us also, made donations to, provide the supplemental feeding for the birds. So we'll post another link if somebody is not familiar with the barn owlet and the journey that we are able to see, the life journey that we are able to see through the life cam. We also have some tickets that are still available for the West Sister Island cruise on August 15th. If anybody's interested, we'll post a link. And then we'll also post a link for our calendar of events that are upcoming, starting with Discover Ottawa Day on August 11th. I know it's 7:01. Before further, taking your time further, Joe, I invite you. Joe will tell us about Shorebird ID. Interestingly, I've only met Joe once, and then the day I met him was at Cullen Park on September 17th, 2021. There was a marble godwit out there that one of my other birding friend, Paul Jasic, had found. And I met Joe there. We both were photographing that. We had a couple of other rarity shorebird show up there, Western Sandpiper and a Baird Sandpiper there. So Joe, welcome. Thank you for doing this session. It seems like, it's going to be a fun 1 hour, but if we go a couple of minutes over, I think you'll be okay. If we take a 2-3 minutes over the time that we have allocated as well. Okay.
All right.
All right, Joe. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, appreciate everybody signing up to talk about shorebirds with me tonight. I know it's a group that intimidates a lot of people, but it happens to be one of my absolute favorites. It's a group of birds that you can really get comfortable with and still find challenges in ID. And I think that's part of why I like them so much is you can see them. They're not hiding in heavy canopy or obscured in view. They're out in the open for the most part, and you can see a group of shorebirds come in and still find little gems in there that you didn't know on first glance. So what TJ was saying is when we were out looking at the marbled godwit and the Western Sandpiper, those were kind of the birds that drew us to the area, but there was other shorebirds mixed in. If I remember correctly, there was a lot of semi-pollinated plovers, and what we thought at the time were semi-pollinated sandpipers were actually a mix of semi-pollinated least and Baird sandpipers, which is also a pretty interesting bird to find. So when we're getting into shorebirds, the challenges are that you don't see them most of the places you go birding. They're habitat specialists. They're going to be where the water is, where the food is. So you're not going to see them in your backyard. You're not going to see them, on the boardwalk, at McGee or somewhere like that, or on a lot of trails where there's not a lot of puddling water. So you're going to have to find the habitat that's suitable for them, and it's not going to be places that you always go. So it might be a flooded farm field or a dried up mud flat from a pond or something, and it changes year to year based on what the conditions of the year provide. So if you have a really dry year, they might go to a larger body of water. So you have to kind of go where the birds are to find them, which is an added level of difficulty if you're used to kind of just hitting your favorite hotspots. So when you look at them, there's not like a slam dunk diagnostic field mark for most of these guys. You're looking for like, oh, there's a a double wing bar on there and the throat's bright orange and I know what that bird is, you're going to have to add up a couple of things when you're starting out to get the actual ID nailed down. Another challenge is that they move constantly. The breeding adults, the non-breeding, the juveniles, molting, they're always on the move. They migrate almost year round, it seems. They're not on breeding territory for very long. So you can have them showing up in July like we are now and have adults in breeding plumage or non-breeding plumage mixed in. And then the juveniles and the molting adults come through and they're all mixed in on the same habitat. So you can see a bunch of birds of the same species that are looking different from each other. So you can't just go with plumage, which is kind of counterintuitive for a lot of the way we bird. We're not looking just at feathers. And there's a lot of them that even at their brightest and best are going to look very, very similar. So I'll give you an example here. This is a photo I took last year. It was a group of shorebirds that came in, and if you look at it, there's one or two that kind of set themselves out. You have set themselves apart. There's a semi-pollinated plover in the kind of the middle left there. There's a dunlin that has that black belly that you see on the left. But the rest of them start blending together a little bit, even though you can see there's some differences in size and posture and things like that. There's a good variety of shorebirds in this flock. We have semi-palmated sandpipers. We have dunlin, we have sanderling, we have leaf sandpiper, and we have white-rum sandpiper. So a group of birds like this that, when you look at it first glance, seems to be very low variety. You're actually going to pull, 6 species out of this? And that's what's fun about it. You think you know exactly what you're looking at, and then you look a little deeper and you find some hidden gems. So when you get started, just get out there and look at them. Don't worry about being an ID expert right off the get-go. That'll come with time. You got to get familiarity with them. And like I said, they're not going to be in your normal spot. So the more chances you have to observe them and enjoy them, that's really going to help you more than almost anything else. Their behavior is going to be a lot different sometimes because of their physical characteristics, longer legs, longer bills. They might be able to feed in deeper water. So once you start picking up on those subtle cues that might not be in the field guide, that'll help you get quicker at IDing them. So when you see a group of sandpipers, a lot of people, what we will do is narrow them down to like a smaller group. So the peeps are the group of smaller shorebirds like leaf, semi-palmated, western sandpipers, small little classic sparrow-sized sandpipers. And then you have your Tringa genus, which are your yellow legs, willets, and things like that. There's also a great variety of other, we'll call them oddballs. So your phalaropes, godwits, avocets, all those more distinctive birds, which we're not gonna touch on tonight because they're a little bit easier. When you see a black-necked stilt with those ridiculously long pink legs and the black and white pattern, you're gonna be able to ID that one fairly easily. But I want to focus tonight on the ones that are going to be challenges that you're going to encounter frequently. So look at the shape. Don't look at the plumage. We're going to talk a lot about proportions, bill shape, leg length, body posture in this presentation tonight. So gather up your clues. See if you can get as many that correspond to a bird that you think you might have and add them up together. And a little aside, if you're birding in a colder temperature, the shape of the bird will change. So a cold dunlin is going to have a lot rounder shape than one on a warm day. So I'll have a couple examples of how the body shape can change with temperature. So if you're out in early April or in November, the bird shape is going to change from what you see in the summertime. So when you're assessing a shorebird, I like to go and compile my list of evidence here. And location can help you too. This was taken at Lake St. Clair Metro Park up in Harrison Township, Michigan. middle of September, and I found this one in a parking lot puddle. So it wasn't ideal habitat, but there was a shorebird there hanging out with killdeer. So when I looked at this bird, first thing I noticed, it was small. It had a big head. It had this sort of cap look to its head and a bill that drooped down. Had warm tones on the back and on the head, shortish legs. But here, one of the key characteristics for this species is it has greenish or yellow legs. So for a least sandpiper, which is what this is, you're going to have these characteristics, and they all add together to be a least sandpiper. So we touched on this earlier, where to find them: mudflats, beaches, flooded fields. For some of the plovers and buff-breasted sandpipers, the ones that aren't so tied to water, you're going to see them on sod farms a lot of times. Ponds for a couple of different species, or if they're dried up ponds, you'll get a bit bigger diversity there. And for some of the specialized rock sandpipers, ruddy turnstones, purple sandpipers, and Dunlin especially, breakwalls later in the season, you can find them hanging out where the waves are crashing on the rocks. So here's how I have them grouped. We have the Calidris genus, which are the peeps, least semi-palmated, sanderling, pectoral, Dunlin, etc. The Tringas, which are the yellow-legged, solitary sandpiper, willets. And then there's plovers, so you have your semi-palmated killdeer, piping plovers, and then some of the larger ones like black-bellied American golden. Dowitchers, which we have two, those are the long and short-billed, and godwits, which are the giant long-billed sandpipers that TJ and I saw one of the marbled godwits out in Cullen Park. And then the phalaropes, which are one of my favorites, that they spin around in circles and they're not restricted to the land. They often will be found pretty far out to sea in a lot of cases. I've seen them out in the Gulf of Maine, 10 miles off of shore in sargassum weed feeding. So we'll start with the peeps. This is a pretty common one that you'll see, the semi-palmated sandpiper. So when you see it, it's kind of an average small sandpiper. The bill on this one is very straight and thick. It's not extremely long. It's got a small size, so it's roughly the same size as its counterpart, the least sandpiper, but it's slightly bigger, but you can't really use that as a field mark unless you have direct comparison, because it's just such a slight difference that you don't want to do that. So for these guys, I like to go with the straight, thick bill, the black legs, which is kind of a trap. If you look at the legs, you can't assume that they're dark because mud can get on the legs of a least sandpiper, which we'll show in the next slide. A couple of behavioral clues for this guy is they tend to do a lot more fighting with each other on the mud flats and just kind of jostling each other around. So you can see they're pretty aggressive when they're feeding with their peers in habitat. And if you get a really good look, you can notice that there is a partial webbing on the toes, which is what semi-palmated relates to in the name. So here's the one that's going to be the comparison species for that. This is the least sandpiper. The first thing I'd like you guys to notice with this guy is the bill is got a finer tip. It droops down a little bit. That is a big clue with these guys, and it's tough to see until you get used to it. So when I said earlier to get out there and spend time with them, that's the type of impression I want you guys to get comfortable with. So when you see the difference in bill, you can note that this one has a finer tip bill that's kind of curved at the end. A lot of times it has a cap that it shows. It can be like a richer tone than a semi-palmated sandpiper. Not always. Sometimes in breeding plumage, they're both pretty colorful. But they always seem to have that kind of drooping bill and cap look to them. It's the smallest of our sandpipers, so that can help you distinguish it amongst some of the other larger birds in this genus. And although this picture does not show it well, they have short green-yellow legs. So if you look at this picture, that is not an obvious field mark. So be careful with that. If you can see the green-yellow, that's kind of a slam dunk for this one, but it's not always going to be present depending on what kind of habitat they're foraging in. If they're getting into their up to their, you know, their belly in mud, that green color is going to be obscured. So here is a direct comparison between those two birds. Bird on the left is the semi-palmated, and the bird on the right is the least. So take a look at this guy. They were shot at the same place at the same time. This was the inland beach at Maumee Bay State Park. So take a look at the bill shape. Take a look at the cap. See the darker cap. Also look at the flatter topped head on that least sandpiper. But the plumage on these guys is going to be so variable that you could see the reverse patterning at times on the primaries and on the mantle of these birds. So don't go straight to that and assume that it's one species or the other. Although least sandpipers, in my experience, tend to have that bolder, richer brown on them more frequently than semi-palmated on their fall migration. It's not something I would rely on 100%. So to make things even more confusing, you have the rarer, but still occasionally seen Western sandpiper. This guy is a little bit larger than both of his cousins. It's got longer legs, a longer bill, which are going to be the field marks that you're going to look for. So look at the build of this bird. It's going to be hunched over a little bit more because it has to reach further down to reach the food because its legs are longer. So it's not going to be kind of as level in its feeding style. It's going to be kind of pitched forward. You also sometimes will see this guy feeding in deeper water. So if you're looking at a group of peeps and one of them is out in deeper water than the rest of them by quite a bit, it's worth taking another look at, because that behavioral difference can tell you something about the physiology of the bird. In this case, that it has longer legs and a longer bill, so it can reach things that are further down than some of the other ones that it might be foraging with. Because we don't get Western sandpipers coming through the Great Lakes region in big numbers. They're usually one-offs or one or two birds in a mixed flock with other Calidris sandpipers. If you get them on their breeding grounds or on their way up to their breeding grounds, there's a good characteristic plumage-wise that they have this kind of nice chestnut color on the back and on the cap that's very vivid compared to semi-palmated or least sandpiper. Also, since the bill has a lot of length, it does have a droop, but not quite the same curve that the least sandpiper does. And out of these four that I've kind of paired up, the sanderling is one that is larger than the other three and has some very specific characteristics that you can use. First thing you're going to notice is this one is really hyperactive. It tends to run along shorelines, does wave chasing. It's a very social bird, so you see a lot of times they're in groups, but not always. It'll have a larger size than semi-palmated least or Western. It has a longer straight bill with a kind of interesting figure-8 shaped nostril. If you get a good look at it up close, or you can zoom in on a photo, or you're looking through a scope, that's a good way to give you a clue about what species you're looking at, is if you have that figure-8 shaped nostril. For me, when I look at them, they just have that black and white look to them a lot of times in non-breeding and juvenile plumage. So you'll get that kind of bright white pattern when they're coming through in non-breeding. And if you look at the foot, they do not have a back toe. That's a good way to, if you can get a good look at them, they don't have a toe on the back of the foot. Now in breeding plumage, you're going to get a lot of these kind of messy, rusty tones mixed in a kind of a mottled pattern. So there's speckles all over these guys, and they do look quite a bit different in the spring when they're heading up north. But the key elements are still there. It still has that figure eight shaped nostril, the long straight bill. It's still going to be wave chasing and running around. It usually moves in fairly large groups of maybe 10 birds or more in spring. I've frequently seen them associating with Dunlin and ruddy turnstones, it seems. They do like beaches and larger bodies of water than some of the other shorebirds. I've rarely seen them on interior mudflats. They almost always seem to be traveling along the Great Lakes or larger lakes. So on beaches are common. And if you ever go down to Florida, these guys will be everywhere, and they can be quite tame. You can get pretty close to them, or they'll, in some cases, hop over your foot, which I've had happen at times with them. So I'm going to stop here and show you a head and bill comparison of the four birds that I've combined here so you can see the difference. So when you're looking at birds that are this similar, those little details are really important. So check out the leaf sandpiper. It's got that thin, fine tip drooping bill. Semi-palmated, it's got that spike kind of blunted at the tip. Western sandpiper, a similar but longer bill to the semi-palmated, but it does often have a bit of a curve to it. And then the sanderling proportionally has a shorter bill than the Western on average, but it's straighter and it has that figure eight nostril. And it has a larger size. So those are the kind of details that I want you to keep in mind, because those are the type of things that don't change with plumage. They're going to be there all the time. Now, one caveat with that is that between the sexes, certain birds will have different bill lengths. So you might have a female that has a longer bill, but the characteristics are going to be the same. And there's a lesser degree of variability with the least and semi-palmated than the Western and the sanderling, which can have a pretty good variation of bill length. So again, it's not always an exact science on this. It's all about adding up all the different elements that you have and all the characteristics that you can find until you get really comfortable, and then it becomes much easier. So what's helpful too is to remove the plumage altogether and look at silhouettes. So here I have the four birds lined up as silhouettes, so you can take an observation of the bill length, the body posture, the leg length, overall size comparison, and see what you guys think without having the distracting details of plumage. So the first one is the semi-palmated. Second one, Western. So if you look here, shorter bill, shorter legs, longer bill, longer legs. Over here is the smallest of these birds, leaf sandpiper. So take a look, shorter legs, bill with a fine tip, curved down. And the largest of these guys, straight bill, longer wings, bigger overall size, at medium length, straight bill, sanderling. So I'm going to pause here and take any questions that you might have about that group of birds, any challenges that you might have. We can talk about it here before we move on to the Tringa genus.
And if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. But so far, I don't see any questions, Joe, but excellent. Like the way you have presented them with those features that are easily seen, and then this silhouette, and then the plumage one. Okay. I feel a little confident I can, try to attempt them when I'm in the field.
All right, so we're going to expand into some of the other birds of the Calidris genus now. Another one that you'll see frequently is the pectoral sandpiper. And a lot of people think of this one as sort of like a giant version of the leaf sandpiper. You got the yellow legs, kind of that mottled, warm toned palette on the back and on the neck and head. These guys are often one of the earlier migrants, so they'll come through the area in April at times. They're not real specific to habitat. They can be very versatile, where they'll be in grassland areas, mud flats, as you see here. They're not as likely to be seen on the bigger bodies of water, I've noticed. They like a little bit of cover, so they're more likely to be seen with, in my estimation, yellow legs and birds that can get a little bit deeper because they have a larger body, longer legs than some of the other birds in the genus. Here's what I was talking about with the body shape. See how much rounder these birds are? This one was taken a couple hours after an ice storm in April. These birds were really cold, so their neck just disappeared on me. But if you look here, they still have those same characteristics. The bill is long, but it has a droop to it. It has an orange base to it. But with these guys, one field mark that is pretty reliable for pectorals is there is a sharp contrast between the streaking on the front of the breast and this white belly. There's a very hard line where it breaks off there. And that is pretty consistent throughout all the plumages for these. So if you have a larger shorebird than your peeps that has that strong delineation between a white belly and a streaky breast, look at the base of the bill. If you see some orange in there and it's longer legged and it has overall warm tones, that's a lot of evidence for a pectoral. These guys are a little bit shyer than some of the other ones, so getting close to them can be difficult at times, but they are a cool one to see. The Dunlin in breeding plumage is probably one of our more beautiful of the smaller shorebirds, and also one of the more easily identified. Right off the bat, you see a lot of things going on with this bird. It's got a very high contrast black belly. It's got a rich chestnut base color to the back with black flecking over the feathers. It's got a large head and a long bill that has a notable downward curve. They're very social, so they'll often be in groups of 50 birds or more. They seem to travel together in larger flocks than a lot of the shorebirds that come through the region. And they're often early and they stay longer in the spring, and then they come later in the fall than almost any of the other shorebirds. So you can see these guys coming through in the fall in October, November, and a lot of them winter pretty far north. I saw them last year in New Jersey in late December. So when they're in non-breeding plumage, they're pretty plain, but those characteristics are still there. There's not a lot going on with the plumage. It's pretty flat, grayish brown, but the bill shape, that doesn't change. It's still long, it still droops, and they still have the large head, the black legs, and so on, even though you don't have the black belly and the colorful back to lean on as much. But if you see a bird late in the season that kind of roughly has no pattern to speak of on the back, but has a long black bill and is fairly small, that's a pretty good indicator that it's a Dunlin. And you'll see these guys, some of them even hang out in the Great Lakes region late into the season, and they'll mix it up with purple sandpipers in November and that kind of stuff on breakwalls. Here's a Baird sandpiper, which is one of my favorites to see. You're going to see way more of these on fall migration. You rarely see them in the spring, I've noticed. But the key thing to look for on Bairds is the wing length. So the first thing you want to look at is see how much longer the wings protrude past the tail. So when you look at the overall shape of this bird, it's got a longer profile. Otherwise, it's fairly average. The beak is mid-length. It's got a fine point to it. It's straight. It's got a steep forehead. In the juvenile plumage, they have this really kind of clean scalloping pattern on the back, but not all of them. The adults are way more plain and can really throw you if you're not careful. So for these guys, look for that wing length first. If you see a kind of a slightly larger peep with long wings, give it another look and see if it might be a Baird's. They are one of the earlier fall migrants. You see them a lot of times in mid-August through the region, and they don't stay very late. I like to think of these guys as sort of, they remind me of, if you look at how to ID a Lincoln sparrow, where you have those buffy tones on the breast with streaking over top. That's what you got going on with the Baird's a lot of times, like a warm, rich brown color behind the streaks on the breast and the head and neck. So if you see a bird with all of those rich tones and the long wings and the dark bill and the dark legs, give it a second look. And here is their other bookend, the white rump sandpiper. This one is a later migrant. It's also one of the long-winged sandpipers, but it's not as dramatic. See, the wings go a little bit past the tail, but not nearly as much as the Baird's. They also have a cooler overall color to them. They're not as warm in tone. The bill is approximately the same. They do have a diagnostic white patch on the rump if you're lucky enough to see it. But a lot of times when they're foraging, that's covered up by their primaries, and their flight feathers are going to obscure that. So unless you see them in flight, you might not be able to reliably observe that. But for these guys, they have a very bulky, muscular form to them. They're not as slender as a Baird's sandpiper. So while they are their counterpart in terms of having the longer wings, the body shape is much more robust. And if you're lucky enough to get a good look at one of these guys, they have a pale reddish base to the lower mandible. And you see that in nearly every one of these birds. So it's not super obvious on some of them. Like this one, it's there, but it's not the first thing you notice about it. But once you see a lot of these, they all will have that pale reddish base to the bill. Going up in size a little bit, you have the red knot. When they are in non-breeding plumage, they are pretty clean gray. They have a nice white edging to the feathers. Otherwise, they're kind of a nondescript, larger Calidris sandpiper. And there's some field marks, but the first thing I want you guys to notice about this one is the size. When it's compared to the other birds of the genus, is going to be quite a bit bigger. It's going to have those greenish yellow legs. It often has a pale eyebrow, not a lot of contrast there. Average bill length that has a thicker base to it. And it often walks along the beach with a kind of horizontal posture, as you see here, where it's very flat and it's not upright and it's not too hunched over. So size compared to its peers is going to be your first clue on this one. Then look into the finer details. Look at the cleanness of the back plumage with the white edges on the wings and the green legs, white eyebrow. Put it all together, you have red knot, which are not, I wouldn't say super rare, but you don't see them most of the time you go out. They're kind of hit or miss. In breeding plumage, it gets a little easier. They have a noticeable reddish, rusty color to the breast and the neck and the throat. When they're in flight, they have long pointed wings. And in breeding plumage, they're just a stunning bird. A lot of great, rich colors. And they're pretty much diagnostic in this plumage where there's not going to be a lot of birds to confuse this one with. So it's just a stunning bird. So I have that group kind of grouped out in the silhouettes as well. So the first one we got here, average bill size and length with the long wings. So that's a Baird's sandpiper. This one, larger head, long drooping bill, kind of larger, but not anything to write home about body shape and size. That's your Dunlin. This is the longer wing, bulkier bodied, straight, mid-sized bill. That's your white rump sandpiper, largest out of this group with your thicker bill and horizontal posture, red knot, and the longer leg, more upright posture, slightly drooping bill here is your pectoral sandpiper. So these guys are all larger than that first group of birds that I showed you. And here is kind of how the head shape compares on all of them. So you can see that there's some similarities on the bill shape for some of them. Others you have, the Dunlin definitely has the longest, curviest bill out of the group. Pectoral has a little bit of that going on too. So you see the challenges that you might have when you line these guys up. But there is enough subtle differences where I think once you get comfortable with them, there's enough differentiation between them that you can get real comfortable. So I'm going to stop here. Was there any questions about that group before we get into the Tringas?
I think there was a question about the first group. What time of the year is best for them to leave? I believe Jackie had that question at the first pause. Like the first group that we saw.
Oh, let's see, non-breeding.
Like the sanderlings, the semi-palmated, what is the best time of the year for them to leave our area?
Well, with migration, you get a couple of factors. In this time of year, you have birds that did not successfully nest. So they tend to go up to, Arctic Circle or wherever their preferred nesting grounds are. And if they don't successfully rear young, they come right back after like a week or two. So those are usually the ones that you see this time of year that were not successful nesting. And those can either be birds that didn't even try because they might be young, like first year birds, and they didn't graduate into that breeding plumage, and they're still kind of figuring it out. And then you have a second group of the successful adults that'll follow the succession with them. And then after that, you'll get juvenile birds mixed in along the way. And that varies based on the species too. But you kind of have that wave where the unsuccessful birds come first, then the successful adults, and then the juveniles. And you also notice that the juveniles are way more approachable on migration because most of them have never seen a person before or have very limited experience with them. So you might be out in mid-July and have a bunch of birds that are really easily frightened. And then you see a group of the same birds a month later and they walk right up to you. What's the difference? They have no experience with people. They don't have an opinion. They haven't formed an opinion about whether they're good or bad yet. So that's the thing with shorebirds is you get them in these waves of different groups. And that's where the plumage is unreliable. And you have to rely on the shape and physical characteristics.
Yeah. And I think similar, maybe you answered this question. John and Jill had a question about when do we see the non-breeding plumage? Is that summer and fall or later in the fall?
It's usually early in the summer for the
Okay.
with some of the ones that weren't successful, and then the later ones along the way in the summer. So they've molted before they've reached us, and then generally there's like a mixture all the way through. So you'll have birds that are halfway through breeding plumage and into non-breeding plumage. So like your Dunlin, usually by the time they get to us, they're in non-breeding plumage. But some of your other ones, like your yellow legs and dowitchers and things like that, they'll be kind of transitioning on their way depending on how far it's been since they've nested. So it's a mixed bag and it's not totally unreliable. But most of the time on your fall, you're going to get a mixture of molt and non-breeding along the way, which is unfortunate because some of these birds are just absolutely gorgeous in breeding plumage, but we don't see them that often because
Yeah.
we're not in the Arctic.
Yeah. And Sue had another question. Could you roughly rank them common to rare in our area?
Sure. Oh, sorry. So the rarest one would probably be the Western sandpiper is fairly rare. Then I would say red knot probably after that, and then probably be a toss up between white rumped and Bairds. Although I'd say probably I'd go white rumps are overlooked a lot more than Bairds. I would say, and then the rest are kind of all fairly common. Just you have to hit the right habitat for them.
Yeah. And we see quite a lot of Dunlins near the refuge, you know.
Yep. Yeah, and that's all going to vary based on what the water levels are like.
Yeah. And Paul had a comment, about white rump often has streaked flanks versus beards, which doesn't. That is another piece of evidence, sometimes helping with ID.
Yeah, so you see the flanks on this Baird's here, and then this one doesn't have a lot of streaking, but there is some coming through on there. Yeah, that's a good tip, Paul.
Very good.
All right.
That's good. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So we'll go into Tringa now, which are your yellow legs and birds that are similar to that. And these guys are you really got to throw out plumage on them. And the bill length is most important and overall size. But if you don't have them directly compared, you're going to have to look at the bill length and shape. So looking at a lesser yellow legs, the bill length is approximately the same as the length of the head. Sometimes it's a little bit longer, but not by much. So it can be difficult to ascertain size when there's just a one-off bird or a group of the same birds. So look at that bill length. They have a kind of a needle bill. It's not very robust. The base of the legs, right where it meets the belly there, it's thinner than the greater, but again, that's more of a subjective way of identifying them. Another good one though is when they're flying, they give call notes in groups of 2, and the greater yellow legs gives them in groups of 3 or 4. So here's your greater yellow legs, and this is a kind of an extreme example of the bill length that you can get on a greater yellow legs. It's much longer than the width of the head. A lot of times, because it's so long, it almost has this impression of being slightly upturned at the end, with a little dip in the middle, and you can get a little bit of a paler base to the bill. And if you look at the the base of the legs, it's thicker here than it is on the lesser yellow legs. But the good news is they're often right next to each other, and you can kind of see here how much larger the greater yellow legs is than the lesser. And looking at the depth of water that they're foraging in can also help. Your greater yellow legs can get out a lot further than the lessers. But if you look at these guys, see how similar that plumage is? It's really hard to separate them based on that. So looking at the bill length and the size is the best way to separate these two. And you get a lot of these guys. They're around for a long duration in the fall and spring. So you'll get to see them in a variety of plumages. So here is a non-breeding yellow legs, but this is a breeding lesser yellow legs. See how much more modeling it has? And in the fall, the greater yellow legs, or well, both yellow legs have a lot less of that modeling, so they're a cleaner looking bird in the fall. So another bird that can kind of throw you for a loop with this group is the solitary sandpiper. It's a very average looking sandpiper. It has a lot of the same characteristics as the yellow legs with some key differences. It has a very distinctive eye ring. It has more of a downward thin curve to the bill. It's more compact with a shorter neck than either of the yellow legs. It has greenish leg color instead of the more golden yellow that you see in the other two. And the back is more of a solid brown, and it has little sprinkles of white in there. So once you get used to those characteristics, this one pops a little bit more than the other two. They also tend to prefer areas with ponds and a lot of vegetation around, and they don't venture out into the open as much as the other yellow legs do. So while you may see them foraging together, these guys seem to be more of a pond sandpiper, in my opinion, where they're going to be around the edges and the margins and not out in the middle of a mud flat. Same with this one. This is the honorary Tringa, the spotted sandpiper. It's another one that we see around here fairly often. It breeds in the area, and it can get confused with some of the other ones. But this one has a behavioral aspect that makes it really easy to differentiate. It bobs its tail constantly. It doesn't really ever stop doing that. So if you see a sandpiper that bobs its tail all the time without stopping, it's a good bet to be a spotted sandpiper. While the other ones can bob their tail, they don't do it to the extent where they're almost obsessive about it like these guys do. Another thing to look for on the spotted sandpiper is this white patch or comma on the shoulder. So it kind of bleeds up over the wing from the belly. It has a distinctive white eye ring. Now, this is a non-breeding bird, doesn't have the spotting that you might think given the name of this bird, but in breeding plumage, it's fairly obvious why they call him a spotted sandpiper. So when you look at this bird, there's a lot more distinctiveness to it. It still has the comma, it's still going to bob the tail, but there's a few more characteristics that are going to stick out. Orange legs, orange bill. It's going to have a supercilium and a dark eye line, and the obvious spotting on the breast and the back. This one can be found on beaches, wastewater treatment plants. Sometimes they're going to be found around dikes and canals too. So they're not as much of a specialist, and we do see them around more frequently breeding in this area. Now this one's a bit rare for this region, but we do see them. It's the willet. Now, the first thing I will say about a willet is their most distinctive characteristic is that they're not distinctive. This shot, you get to see a bit of both aspects of the bird with the wings open, but it's also standing on the ground. But when they have the wings closed, they're basically a giant yellow legs without any of the patterns or bright colors. So they have a thicker bill that's very heavy compared to the rest of the genus. It's drab. It doesn't get much color, breeding or non-breeding. It's going to be kind of grayish. If you get a good look, it does share the semipalmata species name with some of the other birds that we're going to discuss today. So it has the webbed toes, but it's going to be a much more robust bird than the yellow legs. And the main thing that you look at is how contrasty the wing patterns are when it's in flight. When it's running here on the left, it's a very nondescript, larger shorebird. But when it opens its wings, you get that black and white contrast that's very, very eye-catching and distinctive. You guys are also very noisy when they're on breeding territory, so they'll be calling a lot too. But this is these guys kind of, they show up, what is it, like one day where 60 of them will show up through here, you get to see them, and then they're gone. And then sometimes you'll see one-offs in the fall. These were taken in North Carolina, but I have seen them at Howard Marsh, and I think Mommy, I saw one there once. So they tend to favor the larger bodies of water as well, but not exclusively. So I have the head comparison for these guys as well. The willet is far and away the more robust, heavier set bird than the others. It's got a long bill that's really straight, very thick at the base. Greater yellow legs also has a long bill, has a little bit of a pale base to the color of the bill. It's long, but it also has a fine tip. Lesser yellow legs, shorter bill than the greater, but also has a fine tip. It's almost like a needle. And then the finest tip of all of them is the solitary sandpiper, but it does have a slight droop to the end, and it's more dainty out of the four here, and it's also the smallest. So does anybody have any questions about that group before we go on to plovers?
No questions, but Paul just mentioned, April 26th, plus minus 3 days or so, is Willet Day in Northwest Ohio. Yeah,
I knew Paul would
Yeah.
get that reference.
Yeah.
So here's one of the piping plovers that bred on Maumee Beach a few years ago. And this was the mother, I believe, who decided to start preening right while a bunch of people were observing her. And we'll get into birds of that group. So the one that is most familiar, you're going to see everywhere, is the killdeer. It's an excellent reference bird because you see them all the time, and you can use these to compare to the other ones. So with a killdeer, they have a red eye ring, double bands on the breast. It's the largest of the group that we're going to discuss tonight. They're larger than the piping or the semi-palmated plovers. They're very, very vocal, and they're very wide in their distribution. They don't have a strict habitat preference, as I'm sure a lot of you have noticed. They will nest in school playgrounds, near beaches, soccer fields, and they have a very annoying trait of freaking out about people and scaring all the other shorebirds away, even though most of them have seen a person every day of their life and hasn't given them a second look. They will, scream like the world's about to end anytime you even look their way half the time, and they have that distinctive killdeer call. So as a comparison to that is the smaller semi-palmated plover. So first thing you're going to notice here is it doesn't have the larger size. It doesn't have the red eye ring, doesn't have the double bands on the breast. So when you're looking at these smaller plovers, a good thing to note is the overall appearance of the feather color on the back. And that will give you a clue as to where these birds spend most of their time relative to the water. So the darker the color, the more likely they are to spend time near the edge of the water. So these guys are kind of average. They have a mid a mid tone to their back. They have a smaller size than the killdeer. They have yellow legs, kind of a darker cheek patch here. This is a non-breeding bird. The breeding bird is a little bit tougher to separate from a killdeer, but when you get more comfortable with them, you can see that they only have the one neck band. They have the bright orange base to the bill. The back is not as dark. The proportions are a lot smaller. It's just a more petite bird that has a bit of the awe factor that I don't think killdeers really possess, but that's kind of a subjective thing. They're all cute in their own way, and that's generally the way you describe plovers. And I think it's because their eyes are proportionately larger. And what that tells you is that they are a visual feeder. A lot of the shorebirds that we discussed earlier will probe with their bills, and that's why the bills are such a big deal for them. It kind of tells you what kind of feeding habits they have, how deep they can probe into the sand and the mud. These guys pick stuff right off the surface. They see it and they run it down and they grab it. Also means that they're a lot more skittish. They do run and stop when they're foraging. A lot of your sandpipers have a more consistent and tactical approach where they're just kind of pecking at the mud consistently as they move. These guys tend to run in little bursts. Stop, look around, go to the next spot. And if you're freaking them out, they will get longer with their bursts of running. So this is the semi-palmated, and the rarest of these guys in our region, at least, is the piping plover. Now this one is, I think it's listed as endangered in the Great Lakes region. They nest along the shores of Michigan, and there's I think a couple that are in Chicago and then on the East Coast. But they are definitely a bird that if you see one, you're often going to have bands on the legs, and you want to be careful not to disturb them. Keep your dogs on the leash and that kind of stuff. It's just a little side note, protecting these birds if you do encounter them. If you notice, compared to the semi-palmated, look at the color of the back. See how dark that is? And then the lightness to the piping plover. These guys blend in with the white sand, the lighter color sand, really well. They have a bulging, steep forehead that has the result, in my opinion, of giving it kind of a more like worried look, like they have a furrowed brow. And that's kind of how they act too. They're going to be skittish and a little bit wary of people. But again, I've seen them, like the one that was in Mommy was very calm too. But the head shape is one that's kind of interesting on this one. It has a more bulging appearance. The neck band has a broken element to it right near the middle of the breast. It's not as clean as the semi-palmated. It has orangish legs and the orangish bill base as well. In non-breeding plumage, they're very lightly colored. They still have the same bulging forehead shape, less orange on the bill. They have the yellow eye ring, but you have to look at how light the back is. So they're lighter than a semi-palmated sandpiper. And they don't have a dark cheek. So if you go back here, this is a non-breeding or a juvenile semi-palmated. See how dark the cheek is on this and how contrasty the pattern is on the head. And then here, there's very little contrast. It's almost an all light beige bird. So when you compare these guys, the killdeer is the largest of them. It has a bold red eye ring, the longest bill comparatively. Semi-palmated has a darker cheek patch here, which the killdeer also has. And if you look at the piping plover, that lumpy forehead that makes it almost look worried is a good characteristic. And then there's not a lot of contrast on the head and the cheek. So here is the point where I would stop and take any questions that you may have.
We don't have any questions yet, but excellent, and I know the way you presented and put all of these together in a comparative fashion, talked about specific silhouettes, and then your pictures, I should comment, envy. I'm like, envious of the pictures you have. I know you're an excellent photographer, but these are really, really good pictures. Yeah.
Yeah, the cool thing about photographing shorebirds is if you don't mind getting muddy and sandy, you get low on the ground and you get these really clean backgrounds. So they're a great photographic subject. Plus, you get to hang out at the beach a lot of times too.
True. Yeah.
You just got to watch where you're pointing the big lenses. If there's a lot of people there, they have questions. If it's not obvious what you're doing, they have questions.
Yeah. I know a lot of thank you notes are coming, but don't see a question yet.
Okay.
But we are right on time, if no other questions, Joe, thanks again from the friends group, and also, for such an excellent presentation. We'll definitely, I know you have others also, like this is just 101. There would be another advanced one. So we'll definitely look for, connecting with you to see if another session is possible later in the year.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate everybody turning out tonight. It was nice getting to talk about some shorebirds with you guys.
Yeah. Yes. And we'll share the PowerPoint, as when we send the recording out, the PowerPoint would be shared as well, Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Thanks everyone for joining. Happy
Excellent
birding.
program. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Take care.